Cool. Hello. Thank you all for staying around for the last talk of the first day of develop. My name is John Campbell. I'm Technical Director at Triangular Pixels. And today I'm going to be talking to you today about turning internal tools into asset store profit. A small reminder to turn off all your mobiles and various beeping devices. Thank you. And a little background information. Triangular Pixels is a small studio which specializes in new game experiences. We've previously released Unseen Diplomacy, a VR game on PC, and Smash It Plunder, which was released on PlayStation VR. And we also do white label work for people like HTC and the NHS. And we're currently working on the sequel to Unseen Diplomacy 2. But what I'm really here to talk about today is our Unity assets, which isn't something we originally planned for when we set up our small studio. It was something that happened organically over time as a kind of the opportunity arose. We have 4 assets on the asset store: the virtual console, the collider creator, the scene palette, and the physics visualizer. And all of these start as internal tools that we made for ourselves and promoted out and made into their own thing. And I'm here to tell you all that that's a good thing, and you should consider doing the same thing yourselves. So why should you be considering making assets for the Unity Asset Store? As a small studio, one thing that's not immediately obvious is that having a second income stream helps your studio be more robust through lean times. And not just from having more than one income stream, but having an income stream with a different shape. So what I mean by that is we're all familiar with the traditional game sales curve. You have a big spike at the beginning, and then it tails off, and you have the long tail. Assets on the asset store tend to have a very different shape. You don't get that big spike. Instead, what you end up with is a gradual, slow growth, which can last for many years, and then you get spikes on individual sales. And because it's a different shape, that can cover your studio's cash flow between kind of major game releases. And the second thing I think you should be considering this is because you probably already have some great internal tools that you've made yourselves. Because you've created those working on your own games, and it's kind of a shame to tie them just to one game. All of our assets existed to help us make a better game in the first place. And we realized that there's value for us and for everyone in releasing those for other people to use. And finally, because the asset store always needs more good assets, and I want you all to go away and make some awesome assets that I can buy and save myself some time. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that you want to put something on the asset store. How do we start off? The first step is a little background research. Now, you've probably all used the store in some way or form. Doesn't hurt to do some additional research before starting your asset to kind of get your basics down. Knowing what's out there is important because you don't just want to remake an existing asset. And knowing what and why people like particular assets will help you make assets that actually get used rather than ones just sit in their purchase list. Quality indicators are a good one to kind of be aware of when you're browsing the store. You've probably already internalized a bunch of these without being aware of it. If you have a browse the store and see what's grabbing your attention, these are the kind of things I mean as quality indicators. What works as a good trailer video? What icons are descriptive? Which ones look cheap? Which ones put you off? Which descriptions are reassuring and which ones leave you wanting more? Good quality indicators will result in people buying. Bad quality indicators will put people off even if your product is really high quality. Unlike every other asset store, or app store rather, discoverability is hard. You need to think about what's eye-catching and how is your asset going to stand out. So you're looking around at what you can turn into a viable asset. What should you be looking for? For us, we found that successful assets have a simple concept that can be explained in a very short paragraph, the elevator pitch. We've discarded several asset ideas internally because although they're useful and we've made them and they're being used within our team, they're very hard to explain in this short elevator pitch concept. And that makes them very hard to kind of convey to people why they want to use those. You're also looking for a gap in the store where it's either not too crowded, where there's an actual gap, or where the scope is big enough that there can be several assets without kind of treading on each other's toes and ruining each other's successes. And then finally, a manageable scope, which is going to vary a lot depending on your initial concept. In general, we find the asset store favors well-polished and complete assets over ambitious but half-working ones, which in some ways is kind of the inversion of the Steam early access, where people want something conceptually interesting and they will tolerate a certain amount of jank or unfinished. So for scope, that means you need to be able to break it down into something small enough to polish and ship and feel complete, and then iterate on it after it's released. And if there's one slide that I want everybody to take away, it's this one, which is, for us, turning our internal stores into external store assets has been a big success for our studio. If there is an internal tool that we've created, there is an already identified need that couldn't be solved by existing assets, or the existing assets were not good enough that we wanted to make something ourselves. Not only that, you have a proven implementation. You've used it, you know it works. And it's been used hopefully on a shipped or a near shipping game. And then finally, it's a great way to discover tools and assets that you didn't realize were actually useful. A lot of the ones that we've made, if we'd have tried to come up with a list of what would be a good thing on the store, we wouldn't have discovered these things. Only because we had an internal itch and we scratched it, then it becomes a thing that we realize we can promote out. The snag with this, of course, is that we all know what internal tools are like. They're often a bit wonky and a bit unpolished. So you have to anticipate spending a reasonable amount of time polishing it up and bringing them up to a solid standard. Personally, I find the polish time pays off. Even if we put it on the store and no one buys it, that polish time has usually been worth it for our own productivity gains on our own day-to-day quality of life. And after all, if we've used it once, we will probably be using it again. Just now we get the version we've polished up. So this is the disclaimer slide. Why does this work for us? Maybe this isn't you, but this is us. I think it's because we have internally a pretty strong culture of usability and accessibility, not just for our games, but also for our day-to-day development cycle. And for us, that translates into assets and tools that are suitable for this kind of promotion into something external. We know that bad tools can create frustration and long iteration times and lost work and a general bad day at the office. So we will polish up tools internally because we think it's the right thing to do. We also have very hands-on technical designers who want lots of control, and they want to get on and create without having to get other disciplines involved. And we're also somewhat working on niche genres, so we end up butting up against limitations and fresh challenges. And the other part of that is because we're using Unity as our base engine, Unity is a really good platform for this. There's a lot of support for managing dependencies, isolating assets and extracting a chunk of it to be used independently, which is minimally painful compared to some other engines. We like to iterate on content and mechanics, and that, again, implies we should have solid tools to lean on. And in general, we avoid third-party dependencies so that things can stand on their own 2 feet. So things like Odin Inspector, while a great productivity boost, I think long-term that can be a bit of a ball and chain that limits your options in the future. The good news is this is probably your studio as well. It's not a crazy radical idea, so hopefully this applies. So as a bit of a case study, we'll have a look at Technical Light Creator. This was an internal tool we created in 2015, and it was released in 2016. And the internal need was that we needed super accurate physics on dynamic objects for a kind of VR physics setup. And we knew we would have a lot of objects, so we knew this workflow needs to be fast and efficient. We started with a very minimal UI, which you can see with the version 1 there, that was focused on ease of use and speed of content creation. And on the right is version 4. It's currently released in the store. And as you can see, it's accumulated a lot of features as time's gone on, but the core concept remains the same. And my point here is that version 1 doesn't need to be this crazy complicated thing. And when I say version 1 here, I mean the first version you ship to the store, not your first internal revision. The first version you ship to the store doesn't have to be a big complicated version. The feature set can be small as long as it solves the problem, and it solves the problem well. So what do I mean by solve the problem well? For me, that means the workflow is honed and it's efficient. Here, the version 1 UI was simple, but it had already been for a couple of internal iterations where we sat down, worked through the workflow with a designer and a technical person. For instance, we started with a lot of the info in the inspector, which is often the quick go-to for internal tools. And it's really quick to develop. And that's great, but we realized through internal testing that users wanted it as a separate window. So we pulled it to a separate window, and you have a button to link the two. And that does mean dealing with things like selection state yourself, but that's a win for having a workflow that suits what the designers and technical people are trying to do better. And this is kind of make the point that for me, I often find there is a tension between some elegant, scalable UI, where you don't repeat yourself, and it can grow indefinitely and support lots of features, and a UI that lets users get things done without just digging through layers and layers of abstractions and menus and hidden fold-outs and tabs and all that kind of stuff. And in our experience, finding that balance between the two, the elegant end and the practical end, is something that pretty much only happens through use and through sitting them down and listening to your users. Okay, so hopefully by now you've got a compelling asset. It's had its rough edges knocked off. You could probably release it now. But I wanted to go through some kind of practical, technical details on bring that up to a next level of polish. So an early decision you often have to make is picking your base Unity version. Obviously, lots of users run lots of different versions of Unity. I had a much more complicated slide here, but as of last month, Unity have said you can only release new assets using 2019 or later. So all these people here, 2018 people, sorry, you're out of luck. So given that graph, which is from last month, so it's nice and update, I would say for base version, 2019 is the obvious base version to go with. You could have a compelling reason to go 2020, but you should be aware that you're cutting off about 9% of the asset store users. If you are going to be handling multiple versions, there's a small reminder of these very helpful X or newer macros, which let you smoothly use features that are not available in earlier Unity versions. Do be careful of the trap, the very tempting X of Y version of the macros, which only match a specific Unity version. So that makes them very good for working around a specific bug in that version, but it does mean if you're trying to add a feature that you want for all newer versions, you want the all newer version. And for us, I find it a lot more helpful to have the base project, the one that you're actively developing on the lowest version of Unity. This stops Unity from kind of auto-updating anything, updating the serialized version of assets, and that kind of thing. And keeping separate checkouts for your various versions so you can test them, but always developing on the lowest possible version. And then those separate checkouts will come in handy when you actually get to deploying your assets. Now, one bit of feedback that we've got a few times, and it's one I really love, is when a user tells us that our assets feel like a feature that should have been in Unity in the first place, and they just forgot to add. By contrast, there's some assets, and I'm sure you've all used some, that want to scream at you every second and tell you that they're a separate thing and they've got their own branding that they want to push. And in general, I don't think that's a good approach. So what does looking native mean? There's lots of things that you can do that will make your asset feel off compared to the standard Unity UI. Things like text sizes and weights, line spacing, icon sizes, color usage. If any of these don't exactly match what Unity's doing, your asset won't fit in nicely. For example, Unity's standard icon size is only 16 by 16 pixels. And it's really tempting to go bigger than that when you start putting icons in, because you want a bit more fidelity in there. But if you do, then the buttons will get bigger, and suddenly you've got some UI that feels chunky and it doesn't fit in with the rest of the user's IDE. I personally think it's a good idea to find a bit of the Unity UI that is the closest analog to what you're trying to do, and use that as your main reference. And when I say analog, I don't mean something with the same functionality, but I mean something that's displaying the same kind of data or workflow. So if you are displaying graphs, then the profile is a really good reference point. The more obscure bits of Unity, like the timeline, the audio mix, or the profile, the frames, all of these have very different UIs, but they do tie together nicely, so they can be good templates. And then similarly with things like icons, try to keep them mostly monochrome and with a single vivid accent color to draw the eye to the important ones. Don't go overboard with your colors or logos. Some fun UI gotchas that you'll probably only find out later. The dark versus light theme that everybody can choose now. It's very easy to develop using one theme and then realize when you switch to the other that you've broken a bunch of your UI. If you're doing custom controls, my advice here is to reuse colors from existing GUI styles and reference them where possible, because they will update automatically when the user changes from the dark to the light theme. Icons are harder. We tried very hard to keep a single set of icons that worked for both dark and light. And that can be quite tricky. And we tried for a long time with this, we got through several versions, but only when we got to version 4 did we eventually pack it in and say, no, we'll have 2 separate icon sets. And that's reasonably straightforward, like 2 scriptable objects, 2 different icon sets, switch between based on whether the user's using what Unity still calls the Pro skin. It's a bit of legacy. Either way, like, you have to test your icons with both. Desktop DPI can catch you out very easily. Not just the user's resolution, but their DPI setting. We'll change the relative size and of text and buttons, and that can often throw off your carefully aligned UI. And finally, there are subtle layout differences between Unity versions. If you're sticking to something like GUI layout, it's mostly the same, but if you have the spacing can differ between versions, and if you end up having hard-coded pixel offsets, you probably have to put them on a macro to change between Unity versions. Some often bits of overlooked UI polish. Again, we're talking about things that can differentiate your asset from everybody else's. Even very simple icons can help elevate your UI and make it look a lot more professional. Icon design, obviously, focus on the silhouette and the shape rather than the detail. Tooltips are really important, and they're often overlooked. Tooltips are often the first piece of documentation that your users will see, because they are documentation. And it is very tedious to put them everywhere, but your users will thank you for it. A resizable UI is obviously important, and it's one of the things that I find always breaks the most frequently, both as new features go in, but also between user versions. Users will often have quite a large range of resolutions, so your UI needs to be able to go small where needed and respect the user's kind of use of real estate. And just kind of resizing on a window basis is one part of that, but there's other tricks like using foldouts or other user configurable options. The user can readjust their UI to get a look that focuses on what they're trying to do. And finally, do provide an icon for your window. You just have to pass one on the constructor, and it is what I consider the only place to put your actual branding into your asset. One of my pet peeves, assets that are unhappy when you move them from their default location. I'm sure we've all had this at some point. This can happen for a number of reasons. It tends to be when there is hard-coded paths to resources, icons, prefabs, and so on. In general, try and keep everything in your one root folder, which sounds obvious, but lots of assets don't do that. But do remember that for the special folders, like the editor, plugins, resources, you can have versions of those inside your own nested version, own root folder. You don't have to dump into the global ones and pollute those. An ASMDef, an assembly definition file, is really essential now, I think, now that ASMDefs are pretty much working in most versions of Unity. That will let your code compile cleanly, regardless of what else is going on in the user's project. And there will be weirdness going on in the user's project. If you don't have that, they can have a compiler in their scripting, and suddenly all their windows with their tools have gone. So an ASMDef will insulate you from that. And what I think of as my scriptable object trick, create a specific class, create a single instance of that scriptable object, put that in your root folder, and you can use asset database to find assets with the type. And from there, you can get the asset database path. And then if you really need to do something path specific, you've got a robust way of finding that path. And as long as the user moves the whole folder around, that scriptable object asset will go with it, and your code will update and get the new path as it goes on. Optional dependencies. This is a snag that we've bumped into a few times, and there's not an obvious good, best way to deal with this. For instance, the virtual console can be used with either the Oculus SDK or the OpenVR SDK. And the user might have one or both or none installed. So obviously, any specific references in script files or code is potentially just going to come up with a compiler. There are two main kind of ways of dealing with this. Embedded packages. And you've probably seen this for something like Playmaker. Embedding the support files for a particular extended functionality within a package, within your package, and then telling the user to expand that to get the feature they need. And this is really good. And for Playmaker, this makes a lot of sense. They have lots and lots of integrations with other things. The other approach, and this was the one that we ended up taking for Virtual Console, is using the C# reflection. Your code can query to see if particular APIs, particular classes, method names exist, and then either call those dynamically or enable and disable different pieces of different bits of functionality. This is really nice because as far as the user's concerned, there's no configuration. They just drop it in, and if they have those SDKs already installed, then that particular bit of functionality just starts working. Keyboard shortcuts are a lot easier now that 2018 is basically dead. There is this old menu item attribute, and it's fine, but it sucks for assets because it's effectively a hard-coded button mapping in your source code, and there is no way to resolve conflicts between multiple uses of that binding to the same button combination. And for internal stuff, that's fine, but if that's anything you're shipping, it's a pain, and non-technical users will have a hard time tracking those down in the code and changing them. Fortunately, 2019 plus, there is the shortcuts manager, which is essentially the same concept. There is an attribute for functions, and then the big difference here is that key code you pass in, that is the default binding. That is not a hard-coded binding. And then once you've added that, the shortcut becomes available in the shortcut window in the Unity settings, which users should already be aware of, and they can rebind and they can resolve conflicts with other assets. Another common bit of functionality that we find we often need to do is drawing overlays into the scene view. Again, multiple ways of doing this with various trade-offs. The first one, on the scene GUI, a callback that you can register for and then use the handles API. Good for simple shapes, draggable widgets, that kind of thing, but very slow. So if you draw too much for that, you're really going to bog down someone's editor. And not really good for anything complicated. Also important to remember that the scene view doesn't update constantly, like when you're running a game. It's not just drawing frame, 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 frame. So if you change something in your inspector or window or something like that, then you will need to call the scene view repaint all to actually reflect that changes in the scene view itself. The other approach, and potentially more flexible, is the hide flags. Hide flags can be set on any object in the hierarchy via code, which lets you hide them and not save them from the user. For example, the camera that you fly around in the scene view is just a regular camera on a regular game object, but with some hide flags so you don't see it in the hierarchy. And this is great because you can use just regular line renderers, regular mesh renderers, as you would in your game, put them in the hierarchy, and use the hide flags to hide them from the user so that they can't mess with them. And then hide them safe so they don't accidentally get saved while your tool is active. The potential snag with this is because they're actual mesh renderers and line renderers and so on, they will be visible in your game view. So you may or may not need a way to toggle them on or off, or maybe use one of the camera callback events to turn them off before the game view is rendered. And finally, you can still use our old friend on-draw gizmos. It's simple, it's flexible, it's very easy to hook up. But users can turn this off via the little option on the top of their scene view. And sometimes that's great if they want to hide specific things, but if it is a required part of your UI that you are expecting to interact with, then users can get very confused if they've accidentally turned off a bit of your UI and they don't realize that's what they've done. Upgrading. I think we've all had assets that haven't upgraded cleanly. And the key thing here is it's often mangled metafiles. Metafiles are often mangled during day-to-day development. And often that's kind of okay. You check in a new GUID, you fix up the references, it's fine. If you do it for an upgraded version of your asset, then in that user's project, now they've got two versions of the same file, and Unity doesn't know what to do with it. And what it's probably going to do is dump the duplicate somewhere, and you are going to have problems. Kind of okay if it's like a model or a texture, but if it's a code file, you're going to get weird compile errors, and you're going to get unhappy users. So whenever you've got an asset, well, as soon as it's been published once, then you have to be very careful with your asset GUIDs to make sure you're not changing them unless they actually changed. And similarly, once you've done your first release, it's very important not to change your data formats unless you really need to. Scriptable object data, component properties, preferences, very easy to change in your code, but then the serialization won't match. And the key thing to realize is users will be losing data. That sucks for them, and just saying like, just recreate your data in the new version is not a very good response to that. If you really, really need to, there is the formally serialized as attribute, but that only covers renaming and won't help you in terms of changing type. So it's not as helpful as it first seems. Now, if you're a programmer, then the console is probably a pretty important part of your workflow. And you're probably pretty protective about what goes in there. And if you're not a programmer, you probably don't even look at the console and probably don't really pay any attention to the message that appears in it. All of which means that the console is a really bad place to communicate with actual users of your asset or tool. Programs will want it clean. Other non-technical users will ignore it. If there is something that you really need users to see, then put it in your UI directly somewhere else. Be that an inspector or a window or a pop-up or something like that. Other than that, I generally think that it's polite to leave the console quiet. It's simple to set up an internal debug function and then just have a global flag to toggle whether that's on or off, rather than having to strip out of your debug logging every time you're about to do a release. And this might be my most controversial slide. Splash screens suck. Splash screens are really common onboarding. It's a great place to pop up a window, say, hi, here's my asset, here's some blurb, here's some links to some tutorials, here's the first time setup. But users really struggle to find them after they've dismissed them once, and they will often just dismiss them straight away. It very much goes away from the idea of looking native. And due to annoying reasons internally, it's really hard to show them at the correct time and only show it once. And often you'll end up just spamming the user with it. I'm sure we've all had times when you open up, you get a fresh checkout of an existing project, you open it up, bam, like 5 splash windows. And all that does is just reinforce negative feelings with those particular assets. So rather than just ranting, I think splash screen content should be integrated and is better integrated into other places. Setup wizards used the first time a user does a particular action and config doesn't exist can guide them through the initial setup. Documentation links can be directly embedded within the relevant UI rather than just putting it on the splash window. And setting can now be integrated in the Unity settings window with the settings provider. So again, feeling native, fitting in, rather than screaming about your own internal self. And the scripting API is one of our infrequent, but it's still numerous requests that we often get. And it's something I've often pushed back on because having an API can be a really high maintenance overhead. It takes a long time to design, not even develop, to design a high quality API. And even a good one can feel a bit like a straitjacket when you're trying to add new features. My advice is, if you are going to provide one, is to keep it really simple and keep it isolated as much as possible from the rest of your code. Make it clear what's part of your official API and what's not, and know how to, so you know what you can change internally between versions without messing with this external API. In this respect, it's similar to keyboard shortcuts in that you might be able to use the same kind of static class with interface methods for both of them. A good compromise, ship your raw source. There is a lot of paranoia about stealing of code. I think that's mostly overblown. For us, shipping the raw source code rather than obfuscated or in a precompiled DLL has really helped us. It's reduced support requests, and power users have several times emailed us to say they have solved their own questions or extended it because we shipped the source code. Sample scenes. It's kind of obvious, but I find it really useful to differentiate between internal scenes and external showcase scenes. It's very tempting to ship your testing scenes after you've made them. They're designed to test or exercise a particular function or functionality. Why not ship them? And the reason that is good showcase scenes need very careful curation, and testing scenes are often very high churn, and they can be misleading to users. They're just set up to exercise a feature, and then that's it. And then having a small number of showcase scenes can make it easier to sanity check before release. Cool. So there's the technical stuff. We're getting near release, which means branding. Discoverability is hard on any asset store, and a consistent theme can help you really stand out and cross-pollinate purchases. So example here is our technical stuff on the top, the Cinti in the middle, and the Obi on the bottom. They have a nice, clear, repeatable style, and that helps users identify something that maybe used before, and then more likely to use it to buy a different one. Pricing is tough. I'm not sure I have any specific advice here, but compared to Steam, there is a much broader range of acceptable prices on the Unity Asset Store, and that makes pricing harder. A good baseline we usually do is to look for similar assets. Again, not functionally similar, but one that's similar in the same size and complexity. On the plus side, there is a lot less of a race to the bottom, so don't undersell yourselves. And then the other side of don't undersell yourselves is leaving yourself some scope so you can offer a decent reduction when sales come down. Sales are pretty frequent, but again, compared to Steam, you can't opt in. You have to be invited in. Unity curate them. Every time we've been invited in, it's worked out well. So I would recommend that. Obviously you get a spike and then you get a drop off after that, but that drop off only seems to last a month or so. And then refunds, just be consistent. Personally, I provide refunds for anyone that emails and asks because I would rather say yes and get on with my day. And then a reoccurring theme here is a very broad range of users, and that means a broad range of skill levels. And that affects how you write your documentation. I think it's important to focus on getting users from just going as quickly as possible. Quick starts and walkthroughs at the top of your documentation and videos can really help with this. But do remember, because this will be a step-to-step thing, that is probably the bit that goes out of date the fastest. And then another thing that's worked well for us, take your support requests and feed them back into the docs, either into an actual FAQ, as opposed to a questions people wish they'd asked, or integrate it into the documentation properly. And then finally, change lists aren't very useful in the docs. They don't really provide a lot of information to users, but they are useful for the store page. There is a specific box for them when you upload your asset. And then maintenance. We keep an internal Kanban board to keep track of both planned features and user requests. I find it very helpful to keep user requests separated from our kind of potential features or internal requests. Because if it's a user request, then that means that somebody definitely wants it and they have a need. Even if I personally don't find it compelling or don't understand why they want that. And in terms of support, lots of assets will have dedicated thread on the forums, and that seems to work for them, but personally, I find that hard to keep up with. So we do email and Discord, but really the thing to take away from this is it's whatever works for you, and it's something that will be frequently checked and actually answered. Like, nobody wants a dead support channel. So to wrap up, if you've shipped a game or most of the way there, you already have valuable tools and assets that are worth putting on the store. The fact that you've made it and you're using it proves there is a need and proves that it has value. Know what's on the store and where the opportunities are. Time spent doing polishing is time well spent, so anticipate doing some and getting it up to store quality. And finally, internal documentation will often be the weak spot, so don't neglect this when it comes to release. By coincidence, we've just released Collider 2, which has support for skin meshes now, so check that out if that's interesting. This is quite surprising since I was supposed to give this talk at Develop 2020, so this is a little delayed, but we got there. So I hope it's been useful. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? I think we've got someone mic over there.
Hi, that was awesome. I've always wondered about putting some of the stuff I've made on the store as well. But my kind of question to you was, how much of a burden has customer support become? Because obviously you've got you're making gains.
Yeah.
And so this has become like a successful side thing, but has it become that's one thing that's put me off, is this idea of I'm a one-man show. Am I going to have to answer loads of stuff all the time?
Yeah, and it's a valid fear, and it's one I had myself. I would say on average we get maybe an email a month, maybe 2. It's really not as much as I thought. I know we have a Discord channel, and occasionally people pop in there, which in some ways is good because they can scroll past the history, so kind of Discord is useful there. I think there's a couple of reasons why it's low, and I think that's partly because the other side of doing tools is that you can't break a user's game. Our tools output regular Unity stuff. There's no runtime component. And I think if you've got a runtime component, that's when you'll get more support costs, because it's like, you broke my game. I did a weird thing when I unloaded all the prefabs simultaneously and then loaded them again. So tools, I think, have less support, but I just think it's just not as much as I thought it would be. Fingers crossed.
Hi there. You probably don't want to share this, but just a rough kind of feeling, like what percentage of your revenue income is from these tools versus releasing games?
I think the tools have probably surpassed our game income now. Probably not our studio is kind of
It's
split.
not like 5%. Wow.
Our studio is pretty much split between doing our own games, doing contracting, and doing tools. Contracting is obviously reasonably well paid, but it's soul crushing. This is doing better than the games, particularly when you consider the amount of man hours put in.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned releasing raw code.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering what's your logic behind that and why you're not worried about that?
Because in general, we've had users who have been technical enough to tinker with it and solve either a bug they hit or added a minor feature they needed. Or in one case, they needed to script it over about 500 objects. And even though there wasn't a published API for that, because we'd shipped the raw code, they could just go in, expose a few things, and they were able to solve something that would otherwise have spent a lot of clicking on. And I think that outweighs any of the negative sides of doing that.
Never had any negative experience related to the fact that you released raw code?
I mean, the flip side of this is I haven't gone trawling various websites looking for it, but we've seen consistent sales, so it doesn't seem to have affected that. So, cool. I think I'm getting waved on time up, I'm afraid, but I will hang around here if anybody wants to ask any further questions. Cool. Thank you.